In Washington, the atmosphere around trade negotiations had already been strained for months. Discussions between the United States and Canada had become increasingly tense, marked by shifting positions, abrupt political statements, and a growing sense that neither side was prepared to compromise. Yet despite that rising tension, few expected the sudden and direct announcement that President Donald Trump had ordered the talks to be cut off entirely. The message came not during a formal briefing, nor through diplomatic back channels, but through a sharply worded accusation made public online. The president alleged that Canadian authorities had misused the legacy and voice of former US President Ronald Reagan in an anti-tariff media campaign. The tone was blunt and dismissive, leaving little doubt as to the seriousness of the rupture. At the centre of the dispute was a provincial government campaign in Ontario, where officials had attempted to challenge US trade tariffs by invoking Reagan's past statements about cross-border cooperation. According to the Trump administration, the material had been edited in a way that changed the meaning and tone of Reagan's original remarks. Trump called it, in direct public language, an outrageous act. The phrasing was deliberate, signalling not just disagreement, but a formal rebuke. Within hours, the Reagan Presidential Foundation released its own statement, confirming that the audio and video fragments had been taken from a 1980s radio address and that they were studying the legal implications. For the administration and its political base, that validation strengthened the president's position. For Canada, the situation instantly shifted from a trade policy dispute into a credibility challenge. Since Trump's inauguration, the relationship between the two countries had been undergoing gradual and visible transformation. Traditional diplomatic language had given way to more direct, sometimes confrontational phrasing. The United States had imposed tariffs on Canadian aluminum and other key exports, citing national security considerations and domestic industry protection. Canada objected publicly, calling the measures unprovoked and politically motivated. In the months leading up to the break in negotiations, diplomats on both sides engaged in frequent shuttle discussions, each attempting to shape a framework for tariff reduction while preserving political dignity and national interests. Those efforts now appeared suspended indefinitely. The public nature of Trump's accusation, coming not through a formal diplomatic note but through a platform reaching millions, shifted the dynamic of power. It framed the issue in terms of respect, authenticity, and historical legacy, rather than simply trade metrics or tariff schedules. By invoking Reagan, a figure widely respected by conservatives in both the United States and Canada, the dispute tapped into symbolic politics. It was no longer just about steel prices or cross-border trucking standards. It became about narrative ownership, identity, and perceived misrepresentation of national history. In Ottawa, the response was muted at first. Officials sought to verify the scope of the accusation and review the specific campaign material. The statement from Ontario's government had initially framed the campaign as a reminder of shared values, but now it found itself at the centre of an international dispute. Canadian analysts noted that the tone of the president's announcement left little room for immediate reconciliation. The termination of negotiations was framed as a response to misconduct rather than a tactical step in bargaining. That framing mattered because it positioned the United States as the party reacting to a breach of trust, rather than simply hardening a negotiating stance. The break-in talks also highlighted an ongoing theme in the Trump administration's foreign economic policy: the willingness to employ direct personal messaging as a diplomatic instrument. In previous discussions with allied governments, the president had often presented his position through strong declarative statements, using language that framed negotiations in terms of superiority, leverage, and national assertiveness. Supporters argued that this reflected strength and clarity. Critics claimed it undermined long-standing diplomatic processes. Regardless of interpretation, the outcome was visible. Diplomatic communication patterns had shifted, and now that shift carried consequences. 2 weeks prior to the announcement, Canadian Prime Minister Trump-Carney had travelled to Washington for a bilateral meeting aimed at easing tensions. The images of the meeting circulated widely: a measured and formal handshake, statements about mutual respect, and brief symbolism suggesting cooperation. However, beneath the surface, the discussions had been difficult. Trump had made remarks suggesting Canada might benefit from closer integration with the United States, going as far as referencing the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state. Though phrased in a tone that observers described as half serious, half strategic, the implication had clearly unsettled the Canadian delegation. In Ottawa, the comment was interpreted as a signal of how asymmetrical the negotiation framework had become. At that same meeting, Carney had attempted to present data showing the economic impact of the tariffs on both sides of the border, rising production costs, supply chain slowdowns, and long-term risks to employment in manufacturing hubs that rely on cross-border trade. Analysts in Washington had noted that the president was unmoved by the economic modelling, focusing instead on the political narrative of protectionism and control. Carney left Washington without any tangible commitments or adjustments, and the tone of the visit had already suggested that the talks were nearing a critical threshold. The misquotation controversy merely accelerated what many observers already believed was an inevitable impasse. From an economic standpoint, the breakdown of negotiations carried immediate implications. Canadian exporters, particularly in the metals, automotive, and agricultural sectors, now faced continued uncertainty. US importers in states close to the border expressed concern about supply consistency and increased price volatility. Financial analysts warned that prolonged stagnation could encourage businesses to restructure supply routes, seek alternative trading partners, or shift production facilities. Yet despite these clear material risks, the political landscape had become the determining factor. Both sides were navigating internal domestic pressures. In Washington, the administration's focus was on projecting strength and sovereignty. In Ottawa, the priority was protecting national dignity in the face of public criticism. The Reagan controversy served as the focal point for these broader tensions, not because of the specific content of the quote, but because of what it represented. It crystallized larger anxieties about influence, respect, and narrative ownership between close neighbors with deeply interconnected economies. The use of a historic political figure as a rhetorical tool had backfired, transforming a provincial media campaign into an international diplomatic episode. For Trump, framing the issue as an act of misrepresentation aligned with his established pattern of defending historical and ideological symbolism as political leverage. For Canada, the challenge became how to respond without escalating conflict or conceding guilt in a context where public perception mattered as much as factual detail. By the time official spokespeople addressed the situation publicly, the decision to halt negotiations had already reshaped the diplomatic landscape. Economic advisors, trade representatives, and foreign policy officials on both sides were now tasked with managing the outcomes of a dispute that hinged as much on identity and symbolism as on concrete policy. The next steps would no longer be determined solely by technical trade requirements, but by political will, public interpretation, and the capacity of both governments to navigate the consequences of a disagreement that had moved beyond formal negotiation frameworks. In Ottawa, the federal government moved into a mode of structured containment. Senior officials initiated a closed review of the Ontario media materials, requesting precise documentation of the production decisions, sourcing, and editorial oversight. The Prime Minister's office communicated through diplomatic channels that it was prepared to clarify the origins of the campaign and the intentions behind it. However, there was no immediate public admission of wrongdoing. The matter was framed internally as a provincial initiative with political implications that now had to be managed at the national level. Within Canada's federal structure, the distinction between provincial actions and national diplomatic responsibility was well understood in legal terms, but rarely tested at this scale in international affairs. Provincial governments often conduct promotional or economic messaging campaigns, yet the effects of those messages seldom extend into the realm of international diplomatic tension. Here, the consequences were different. The president's decision to halt trade negotiations had elevated a regional communications strategy into a matter with strategic national consequences. The federal government now had to determine whether clarifying the intent of the campaign would be sufficient or whether a more formal statement would be required to stabilize relations. In Washington, the White House maintained a firm posture. Officials emphasized that the issue was not solely about the accuracy of Reagan's quoted remarks, but about what the administration framed as a breach of diplomatic respect. Their position was that editing Reagan's words into a message opposing US policy altered the dignity of historical representation in a manner inconsistent with Allied conduct. For Trump's advisors, the diplomatic objective had already shifted. The issue had moved away from tariff terms and toward demonstrating that misrepresentation would carry consequences. the US Trade Representative's office confirmed that all ongoing sessions, draft policy discussions, and scheduled negotiation rounds were suspended indefinitely. This procedural freeze meant that working groups focused on sector-specific trade issues, agriculture, automotive standards, border logistics, were instructed to halt document revisions. Communication lines that had been active daily now shifted to administrative standby. The tone of the suspension was not framed as temporary or conditional. It was presented as the result of a clear violation that required acknowledgement before further progress. Canadian officials recognized that the structure of the suspension implied a demand for corrective action. In diplomatic terms, this typically requires either a clarifying statement, an apology, or a formal withdrawal of contested material. However, each option carried domestic implications. A clarification could be interpreted as insufficient in Washington. A formal apology could be portrayed internally as capitulation. The federal government's approach shifted toward careful language, expressing respect for historical legacy while not conceding wrongdoing. The aim was to leave open a path toward resumed negotiations without altering internal political positioning. At the ministerial level, Canada's Foreign Affairs leadership advised the Prime Minister that the suspension of negotiations would likely have layered effects. The halting of formal trade discussions extended beyond tariffs. It risked slowing progress on border coordination frameworks, joint technology standards, and regulatory alignment. These mechanisms underpinned critical systems that facilitated daily economic activity across the longest undefended border in the world. The message was clear: while the dispute originated in a symbolic controversy, the structural impact could extend into the operational stability of cross-border systems. In Washington, senior advisors to the president assessed the situation through a lens of strategic bargaining. The administration viewed the suspension as strengthening its negotiating position. By framing Canada as the party at fault, it created a context in which any future concessions by Canada could be presented domestically as the restoration of respect rather than economic compromise. This narrative structure was consistent with the administration's broader diplomatic strategy, which frequently intertwined negotiations with public signalling and historical symbolism. During internal discussions, US officials acknowledged that the controversy around the Reagan material provided a clear and politically durable justification for halting talks. Unlike trade deficits or tariff rates, which can be disputed through economic data, the question of misrepresentation of a historical figure's words could be framed as a matter of principle. This distinction allowed the administration to define the trade relationship not merely in transactional economic terms, but in terms of loyalty, alignment, and identity. Such framing tended to reduce the space available for technical negotiation, favouring a posture defined by unilateral decision-making. Meanwhile, within the Canadian government, the prime concern became preventing the dispute from escalating into a broader diplomatic rift. Privately, Canadian officials recognised that the Reagan controversy was not the root cause of the breakdown, but a catalyst. The deeper tension lay in the imbalance of power in the negotiations. From the US perspective, tariffs were a strategic tool used to shape global trade flows and domestic industrial conditions. From the Canadian perspective, the tariffs threatened core export sectors and challenged economic sovereignty. The Reagan controversy merely provided a clear boundary line where diplomatic restraint gave way to decisive action. This recognition guided Ottawa's strategic response. Rather than escalating through public rebuttal, the Canadian government aimed to preserve channels for restoration. The diplomatic language was precise. Canada continued to value the bilateral relationship, viewed the use of historical statements as a matter of context rather than intention, and remained open to resuming discussions when appropriate conditions allowed. The tone was neutral, measured, and consistent. It was designed to prevent deterioration while avoiding commitments that could be interpreted as concessionary. In Washington, the administration monitored the language closely. The absence of an explicit acknowledgement of wrongdoing was noted. However, because Canada avoided direct challenge to the president's framing, the situation stabilized at the level of suspended negotiations rather than escalating into formal diplomatic retaliation. The United States did not pursue additional punitive measures or new tariff actions in the immediate aftermath. Instead, the situation entered a phase of strategic waiting. The administration signaled that the restoration of talks would depend on an affirmative act by the Canadian government, something that demonstrated recognition of the seriousness of the issue No such step was immediately taken. Instead, both sides maintained controlled, deliberate postures. Exchange occurred primarily through diplomatic staff and policy envoys rather than public statements. Meetings were conducted in private settings, focused on clarifying procedural pathways rather than advancing trade terms. The emphasis remained on preventing further escalation rather than achieving resolution. This phase of controlled diplomatic pause created an unusual dynamic. Both governments understood the cost of prolonged suspension. Both understood the symbolic stakes, yet neither side moved decisively to resolve the dispute. The situation became defined not by active confrontation, but by deliberate stillness, a strategic holding pattern in which each government waited for the other to initiate the first concrete step. It was within this environment of carefully maintained stasis that the next developments would unfold, shaped not by economic procedure, but by political necessity.